Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Art Infused Student Leadership Projects. I'm Kristen Christman, Education Manager at Crayola, and your host for today. Today's panelists are amazing. We have Sherry Sturman, Crayola Director of Education, along with Nancy Horvat, Multi-Tier Support System Specialist, and Jessica Laura, Director of Strategic Initiatives and Partnerships out of California. Nancy and Jessica will be sharing some wonderful insights from their schools and from their students today. And if you aren't already a member of the Champion Creativity community on EdWeb, we encourage you to join today. It's edweb.net/creativity. You'll receive the benefits you see on the screen, invitations for upcoming webinars, recordings, CE quizzes, and online discussions. And finally, if you're listening live today, you will, within the next 24 hours, receive your CE certificate via email. If you're watching this as a recording, you need to take the CE quiz. If you're also joining by phone, you need to take the CE quiz to be able to receive your CE certificate. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it along to Sherry Sturman.
Great, thank you. We are really excited about the topic today. This is going to be a discussion around what educators can do to help students explore leadership concepts, leadership visions, and most importantly, their own leadership qualities. So the projects that you're going to hear about today are great in helping students think more deeply and create their own personal narrative about their leadership qualities. Some of that is challenging some assumptions around authority and decision making, but most importantly, about giving students voice and agency to increase their personal investment in their learning. So for those of you who participated in the Champion Creativity webinars before, you know we have a fun tradition in which we, when you post artwork that was inspired by the webinar, our way of thanking you is to send you free Crayola product. So for this webinar, we'd like you to post a sketch that makes your thinking visible, something that was inspired by this session. It could be either a student leadership project or it could be exploring these leadership exercises with your colleagues at a PLC or staff meeting. Whatever that inspiration in the art, we urge you to post it in the community. And for the first educators who do post this in the Champion Creativity community, you'll receive a case of Crayola multicultural crayons. So we look forward to seeing your art. We always like to outline the objectives so we're all on the same page as far as what we're going to be doing today. And the one that I'm most thrilled about, is Nancy's going to be sharing with us what she learned listening to students, right? So she asked, what do students think leadership means? And that's so important for us, not to come at this with a preset agenda, but to actually start with some information collection, the insights students have about leadership. And that enables us to see how their thinking evolves and grows through the exercise. Then we're going to be talking about leadership qualities, building upon the insights from students, and thinking about how art activities are related to the leadership qualities of communicating with clarity, observation, risk-taking, vulnerability, reflection, and being able to use your reflections to adapt. And really the ultimate piece of this is this deeper level of understanding of self and others. We're going to look at art projects that students have done that make their understanding of leadership visible, really tangible. And to those of you who attended, we like to end with your personal reflection so that you plan your next steps. What are you going to do in your learning environment? So we thought it'd be fun to start off with a poll. And before we show you, or Nancy tells you what the students taught her about their initial thoughts of leadership qualities, we want to ask you, when students were asked, what are leadership qualities? What do you think they said? And so in this poll, I'm going to just open up the poll now. You're going to have an opportunity to vote for one of these, and we're going to all see the uh, the group's thinking. So please go in, read your choices, and vote. And it's a great way for us to see what those of you participating at the other end of the webinar are thinking. So we're getting quite a bit of momentum on listening, which is so consistent with what you focused on in your conversations with the kids.
Yes, it is.
So that third one is sort of interesting, right? Like kids thinking that the student who does what they're asked is the leader, right? I mean, that's sometimes where kids start until they think through it's not always being compliant or following authority, but having some original thought.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Okay,
Self-control and patience is coming in pretty low.
Oh, we've got a few more. Okay. Do we want to wait another second or two? What do you think, Sherry?
Yeah, but before you close it, because the only time that people will have to see your what you're responding to is if you keep it open. Once we close it, we won't be able to see anymore. I just think it's fascinating that one of the lowest here is self-control and patience and building trust. Oh,
I do like the
fact that you typed in Peggy. Did you see Peggy's note? She typed, I love when participants type in the text box. So you're right. Being a listener does involve self-control and patience. Absolutely.
Yes, it does.
They are definitely related. Oh, good question,
how
Judy.
old were the
Did you want to answer now? How old were they?
I sure will. They were 10 and 11-year-olds. They were fifth graders. The group that I pulled in, they were a group that were recommended by one of my visual arts teachers as well as their homeroom teachers. And it's interesting even who the homeroom teachers saw as strong leaders when I got them together. You know, in that small group, they behaved a little differently. It was very interesting. But these are kids that are ready for middle school.
So, wow, I think we've got a definite front runner here. What do you think about the listens to others' ideas? Did that surprise you?
Listens to others definitely was important throughout our conversation.
Okay, so it looks like
we have a comment.
Pretty much finished the voting. Yeah.
Okay. Do you want me to stop the voting then, Sherry? Is that okay?
Yeah, I think you can go ahead now. We've got 105 votes. Pretty good picture. Great, thank you.
Okay, and I'm going to close that. All right. Very interesting. I'm going to share a little bit with you before I actually tell you what their top responses are or were. We sat down together. It was a group of 7, and again, they were 10 and 11-year-olds, and my little school is K through 5. So these were the oldest in the school. And we were told, or I told them right up front, that our whole focus through our meetings was going to be leadership. And they right away began a buzz, and they have some political things they wanted to say, but we got back to the measure at hand, which was what did we personally consider leadership and how does leadership work. And you can see before you a photograph of the whiteboard and exactly how they responded. Leadership leaders are someone who, they reach for their dreams. They lead someone else to victory. I thought that was kind of interesting. They know how to do teamwork. They must be trustworthy. And we came back to trust time and time again, so we underlined that. Leadership is individualized. And if you saw the group I worked with, I think that's definitely true. They had to take responsibility, and we talked a lot about good decisions and bad decisions and the consequences of both. They set a good example. I'm going to leave that right there. They inspire others. They inspire pride, and they're looking to accomplish something. We just had a little state election here yesterday, as a matter of fact, in Pennsylvania, and there was a little buzz this morning coming in about the election. But they had definite ideas for just being 10 and 11-year-olds. A couple of things that really resounded with them was the leadership, the whole concept of leadership and pride, you know, having pride in your community and building up your community, and a focus on what are you trying to accomplish? What do you want for your community? Excuse me. They talked about the work that goes into accomplishing something. They didn't expect it to happen just overnight or, hey, we want this, it's ours. And also that don't expect someone else to do the work for you, that you have to get out there and get your fingers dirty as well and pitch in along with the rest of the group. Near the close of our first discussion, we went back to our list and we added a couple of things that I thought were interesting. One was a leader needs to be a risk taker, which was kind of interesting. They have to evaluate what is it we're looking to be done and what could be done. We need to look at it from all perspectives. So we're looking at more of a global concept here as opposed to just what do we need locally. And then they added a good listener. So remembering not to dismiss anyone's ideas, to listen to everyone's, because there's good in everyone's idea. Some pieces can't be used, but everyone has an opinion that has to be valued. So you need to think to yourself, how do these responses help us to understand what's inside their heads, what they're thinking about? And I'm trying the whole time, you're trying not to guide them, well, this is leadership, this is government, this is how it works. Because it doesn't always work the same way. Some places it works one way, other places another way. So they really talked about what was truly important to them when considering leadership as opposed to what they've heard from the adults in their lives. And we generated a list of characteristics that they would expect to find in a leader. And I'm going to go through those before I tell you the result of their poll. I'm going to click now. Okay. They said leader has to be trustworthy, kind, responsible, hardworking. The leader has to be a thinker, have pride in self as well as pride in one's community, pride in what they're trying to accomplish. They have to be respectful of their team. And I asked them, well, who exactly is the team? Is it just, you know, your advisors around you as a leader? And they said, oh, no, everybody in the community is part of the team. I like that. They had to see or consider everyone's point of view. They had to be trustworthy. And the last one they added is they have to be intelligent. Okay. So we met 5 or 6 times. We had different activities we did each time. But in the end, I asked them to take a poll and to pare their responses down of what they thought was most important to 3. And the 3 that they came up with as most important were kind, respectful, and trustworthy. And their number 1 was trust. They had to be able to trust their leaders. So what do you think about that? I kind of liked it. Alrighty. I asked them during maybe our first or second meeting to illustrate one of the characteristics, whichever one they chose, to give some idea of what was important to them. Here are 3. We hit them all. Trustworthy, here's trust, and respect. Each of the students did. And they chose them on their own. I did not ask them. I actually had a couple of people do trustworthy, but they chose whichever word they wanted to illustrate for us. And here's what we got initially. All righty. So, essential questions. We always have a tough time with essential questions because we're concerned about making them too narrow, too easily answered. We want to keep them broad, but yet reachable for the students. And during our conversation, we tried to take the whole idea of leadership a little deeper and looking at how leaders get things accomplished, or do they always get them accomplished? A couple of questions that they came up with to help focus our conversation. These were great. How do leaders get things done? How do leaders consider the past, or do they consider it? How might looking at the past help make decisions better for today? Must leaders be good at shaping new directions? If so, what influences their decision making? Are leaders always right? And if not, what happens when they make poor decisions? Why is listening important? How does clarity help with getting things accomplished? How do we teach leaders? Or how do we learn from leaders? How do leaders learn from others? And what is a lifelong learner? This one almost floored me. And how does being one help to build leadership? These are the questions that my fifth graders came up with. Perhaps the most interesting conversation that arose when we chatted was the fallout from poor decision-making on the part of leaders. Students chimed in with how everyone in the community then had to suffer the consequences of those poor decisions and had to turn around and work towards rectifying whatever problems arose. They were a little frustrated at this point, and we went back to a little more art activity, which we're going to get into in a minute. But one last thing I wanted to share with you. Students tied the idea of being a good listener in with being a good leader. So we're going back time and time again to that listening piece. They told me that being a good listener, one should be able to differentiate between a good and bad decision. And we never really got to the bottom of that, but we do talk about it more because I think we all make decisions thinking they are the best. But, you know, we talked about that more. A few students tied this into being a continuous learner so that the final decision maker would have all the most up-to-date information before making a final commitment for his or her group. So as you listen to me here, I want you to consider the following. How does one's questioning technique as a leader or one's use of essential questions help to encourage independent thinking in conversation? Think about that for your classrooms. How do we do that? How do we get that accomplished? Is it essential to success to have independent thought? Is it essential to the development of leadership skills? How does exposing students to this type of questioning assist in developing leaders? Great engagement on the part of everyone in the group. I had 7 kids that were wild, and to this day, they come out off the buses every morning wanting to know for a meeting. Everyone had an opinion, and they felt safe in expressing it, which I thought was wonderful. We had established at our very first conversation that we would use all of our best listening skills to honor and value everyone's opinion and consider the questions and how they help to guide our discussion, but not lead the discussion and the turns that we took. So you have before you a great piece of artwork by a gentleman named Joel Shapiro. And I really would like to have shown this slide without the information at the bottom. So I want you to imagine it without the name and the title there. Think about if you didn't know who did the artwork or what its title was, what would you be thinking? If you showed it to your students, how might they respond to it? If they couldn't see it, but you were describing it to them, how might you describe it? And then a few minutes later, tell them there's a gentleman named Joel Shapiro who created this artwork. A few minutes after that, he called this toss-up. Now, this is the point at which we're beginning to get a vision. Who's this Joel Shapiro guy? Would you tell them, if they couldn't see it, the colors that were involved? You were the one doing the speaking. What would you tell them for them to be able to visualize what was on this artwork? As we're looking to develop student leaders, we have to model for them what speaking and listening with clarity looks like. How much information do you get just by looking at this piece? How much information is added when we tell you who the author is, or the artist is, as well as what the title is? As an active listener, perhaps one who cannot see the artwork, how does the conversation bring meaning to the artwork you're trying to visualize in your mind? Do we all have to gain the same meaning from the artwork or from the description? Do we have to come up with the same picture? Think about that. How does our individual background knowledge influence our interpretation, either visually or auditorily? How does the guided release of information about this artwork allow students to bring in their own personal backgrounds for interpretation, which will apply what they already know? Think about the process and how it moves the experience of engaging visually or in their mind from ordinary, this is a piece of artwork, to extraordinary. Wow, look what I've created. Let's compare it to what the author's vision or the artist's vision was. There we have, I believe, personal meaning and personal connection. So as you're guiding those students, here are a couple of essential questions. Oh, I'm sorry, here's the activity. I'm jumping ahead here, folks. If you take your students and form them into small groups, perhaps of 3, or have them form themselves into small groups of 3, have one be the descriptor, the verbal person, and the other 2 the listeners. Speak with clarity. As a drawer, I would have to listen and draw what I heard, as well as my partner would, and then I would like to take the time to compare what we each got from the experience. Do our pictures look exactly the same? If not, what influenced the differences? Was it a phrase that was used? Was it the color red? The shade of red? The shade of blue? When I see this, I see USA all over it. Was it a reference to the United States? Okay. So think about that. Think about how we can be those descriptors, or how the students can be those descriptors, and how they can speak with clarity, excuse me, and how other students can listen intently to accomplish what we need to accomplish. Alrighty. And here we have some of my 5th graders, and they are doing their artwork. They were doing some listening. Some were doing some conversing. And we had a cycle going of reflecting on, well, you said this, but I heard that. How does it make a difference? How does that interpretation come into play? Okay. I'm going to click one more time here, folks.
Oh, yep. Thank you.
Okay.
So, Nance, I love the way you shared with us how students saw Joe Shapiro's work and how, as they described it to each other, and they were producing their own interpretations of it based on what they were listening. That's a really strong listening and observing exercise. We want to introduce now another exercise that can be done with students. And it's we're going to use a unique protocol that we've come up with that enables us to read art, right? To decode art as if we were decoding text. And we use the acronym SEEK because not only does the word, sound exactly what we're doing, we're seeking more information, we're searching for meaning, we're trying to find out, to understand, but also every letter of that acronym stands for the four-step process that we use in this protocol. So you can use this on any piece of artwork. We have on the screen a wonderful mural by Roy Lichtenstein, which has a fascinating history. We actually have a relationship with the Foundation for Art and Preservation in Embassies, and this mural is going to be reproduced in the embassy in Mexico City. And so it's going to be coming back to life again and shared with our neighboring country. So you could use this with a piece of fine art like this Lichtenstein piece, or you can use it with illustrations in a children's book. It's a wonderful way to read the illustrations and get insights on the story and the character. And you can also use this protocol on artwork that students make and that teachers make. Really, any piece of visual can be read. And so I love the protocol because it is so flexible and so insightful. So let's just go through the four-step process. The first is you do careful looking, right? So you observe the piece of art. And the S is see. What do you see? And we're going to ask in a few moments for people to use the text box to tell us all the answers to these four steps. So what do you see? What is the evidence, right? So why do you say that? Describe the evidence that is in the art that supports your thought. The second E is explain. Explain the artist's decisions. So really examine how was this created, right? You look at the composition, but you also look at the choice of techniques and colors and proportions, the flow of the piece as you're reading it, right? And how is that setting a tone and sending a message? So you're explaining your thoughts and feelings around the artist's intention. And in this four-step protocol, my favorite part is the K, the know. Because this is where we ask students, or we're going to ask our participants, so what do we know and what else do we want to know? So, for example, in this piece, we know that Roy Lichtenstein made this piece as a temporary exhibit in the Green Street Gallery, right? Leo Castelli's Green Street Gallery. And he knew that it was going to come down, but all this work in, huge piece, he knew it was going to come down in 3 months and didn't know if it was going to have a life again. And so what else do we know? We know that it is going to be recreated in the embassy, and we also know that a prototype of it is created right now in the State Department's Center for Diplomacy Education in Washington, D.C. So there's some things that we know, and what else do we want to know, right? And so, wow, I had so many questions when I first saw this that I thought could never be answered, and then I found that there are some short videos of Roy Lichtenstein that describe his intention, and all of a sudden I learned so much more. So he was able, it's always fascinating when we have an artist who has passed and we're able to hear in their own voice through videos what they were intending. So we're going to give you a little bit of a close-up because we're going to actually bring pieces, it was pretty small in the original piece, so we did a little repositioning it here so you can see more. So I'm going to ask all the participants to please use the chat box and read this art as if it was text. So tell us what you see. Describe in the text box what is the evidence, right? Then explain. Explain what you think the artist's intention was, the proportion and the colors and the flow. And then what do you want to know? So using SEEK, what I love about this simple protocol is that it's based in all the things we know are good at education, right? It's observation-based, evidence-based, inquiry-based. So let's start seeing some text chats. What do you see? I'm sure somebody's seeing the funnel and the pyramid. I'd love to hear what you see as you're going further on. Oh, I can see Peggy's already done some searches. Absolutely. I'm so glad that you found a reference and a link there. And you're going to start to see even more buzz about this Lichtenstein piece as it is going to be displayed, as this commitment is being made. A group of philanthropists are funding its reconstruction in the embassy. So you see, so thank you, Donna. You see the composition book, right? And you see the bright colors. Mm-hmm. So you saw it like a rope. Thank you. Julie saw it as a rope. The bright colors. The Swiss cheese. Oh, you see bacon. Oh, that's fascinating, Mary. Oh, thank you. That's Mary Arnold from Indiana. We know Mary. So actually, he describes it as a paint streak, but I love that Mary saw it as bacon. I love that. You see the chair. Yep. Lots of everyday items. Isn't that fascinating? Most of these pieces truly are everyday items. And I think that's what, I was waiting. Here you go, Donna. I was waiting for that. Toilet paper, but you weren't sure. You put a question mark after the toilet paper. I can tell you hands down, I have been talking about this mural for months. Nance, when was the first time we used this mural? Back, oh my gosh, a number of months ago. And we kept describing the toilet paper. But then I watched Roy Lichtenstein video, and I learned. What do you think it might be if it wasn't toilet paper? Let's see some things in the text box. If it wasn't toilet paper, what else do you think it might be? You got it. You got it, Catherine. Adding machine tape, which I don't even know if they still make anymore. I'm just not that familiar with adding machines. But when Roy Lichtenstein describes in the video what he put in this mural and why, and I don't want to steal all his thunder so that you can watch these clips online, but he clearly describes the adding machine tape. And I'm like, really? It was so much more fun when it was toilet paper. So, you haven't had lunch yet, so this Swiss cheese and bacon are looking delicious to you. I love that. Okay, so start moving to what you know and what you want to know. I'd love to see some questions. We've done a great job with the observation. Let's get to the inquiry. What would you want to know? What would you want to know? Okay, this could be your desk. Oh, who is the portrait of? Interesting. So I just will share a little bit without giving too much away. The way Roy Lichtenstein described it in the video wasn't so much of who the portrait was, but that he put that portrait there because he was inspired by Picasso. And then that was a Picasso-esque portrait. And so some things he did that were very, what he called sort of ordinary and mundane, and elevated them to a point of honor. And he also then put a lot of what he honors, which is the Picasso. So you would want the portrait to be a scientist. It could be any of that. So what I got today, it was great hearing your input. I want to switch over now to Jessica, because Jessica actually got insights from her students, and I want to hear what her students said. Thank you, Jess.
Oops, sorry. Okay, so like Nancy, I actually framed this activity as a part of a conversation actually on leadership. And so the students and I, before we actually jumped into really looking at this mural, we really discussed what are those traits that leaders have. And I challenged them when we were looking at this painting to be thinking about how using art could help develop their leadership traits better. And I challenged them and asked them what in this piece and what in these activities I'm going to ask you to do will help you become a better leader. And so when we were looking at this piece of art, as well as when we were discussing it, it was interesting because the students really did a great job of really referencing back to some of the things that they actually discussed with leadership. And so let's get started in looking at some of their results. I let them know, and we used this piece of this tool called a focus finding tool. And so essentially, we really I wanted them to be able to focus on individual items. And so because we had a great conversation about how this Green Street mural really was about taking ordinary things and making them come alive for other people. Like, who would have thought that a piece of artwork would have a piece of Swiss cheese in it? And so we really were using this focus finding technique so that we could actually really look at what he was looking at. And so if we go back and think about Seek specifically, the students, when they were looking at the artwork, when they're using Seek, they came up with similar things to we have in our chat, right? They saw bacon. They were probably also hungry. They saw funnels. And then it was really interesting to see which kids were zooming in really far and which kids were sort of like, hey, I don't see anything. What's he doing? And then as the conversation progressed, they started looking more closely as well and really challenging them to provide evidence. And it was really interesting to hear them talk about how they're like, this is just like English class. I have to provide evidence on what I see. And in my math, I'm explaining my thinking. And so it was a great opportunity for them to sort of be like, this is what these are life skills. And this is what you do every day. And it was forcing them to, so they also thought it was a piece of toilet paper. And the rationale was they actually thought the white thing next to it was a toilet. And so that was actually their evidence that actually had to be a piece of toilet paper with a toilet next to it, and they're both everyday objects. I think it's actually a mouse, but for fourth graders today, that's not necessarily. My students don't use mice, right? We use laptops, and they actually use trackpads. And so it was also a very interesting conversation with them about how things in the past can look different for things to people today. And so what the viewer sees isn't necessarily what the artist intended because they were in a different context. And so the students talked about how they never heard of, adding machines. Why would they think about an adding machine? And so they saw everyday objects. They saw evidence of why those everyday objects were there. And they had the greatest conversations about what they wanted to know next. I shared with them that this was a mural in a gallery and that it was only there for 6 weeks. And they wanted to know why. Why was he okay with that? Was that what he did on purpose? And tying back into the leadership, was that intentional? Is it a way to make people really excited? Do leaders make people really excited about things and convince them that what they're saying is good because you're going to get rid of it? There were some interesting conversations about like how to do it kind of more like propaganda. And in their minds, they're thinking about leaders because I'd already framed them as such. And so they were like, oh, well, he's famous because he does things like destroy pieces of art. And they wanted to know more about why he might do that, or if that was actually correct. And so this is a fabulous piece of art to really get into conversations about how artists choose what they make and what is considered good art. And so some of the students at first were like, this isn't art. There's a toilet in the picture. That's, artists don't draw about toilets. And so it was an interesting way to really actually look at their misconceptions of what art might be and what art might not be. And then we moved on and I challenged them that they themselves were going to take ordinary objects and make them extraordinary. And so again, we use this cardboard square to really help us focus. And I loved it's almost like you plant them in the audience every once in a while. This one student was like, oh, leaders need to focus. They need to just be able to zoom in on something because otherwise they don't get things done. And I was like, oh, thank you, child, who was paying attention. But it was really great to be like, for them to almost immediately start tying some of the conversations we'd had about leaders and what leaders need to be able to do with this art lesson that seems that there might be a disconnect. And so I challenged them to use their viewfinders as a lens, and that actually come out of some of our conversations about what a leader was able to see different people's points of view, and that this could be a tool. And this focusing on things allowed leaders to see things in new ways, and how that actually seeing things in new ways was a leadership skill that they wanted to develop. Which I was floored by. I was like, oh, you really do pay attention. And so they went off, they took their viewfinders and they went off and found ordinary objects in the classroom to bring alive, to see in new ways. And so you'll see there's a student who is working on her illustration as well as an example of student artwork. And they really enjoyed the opportunity to focus on stuff that they hadn't seen previously. And so I heard things like, oh, I never realized that my water bottle actually has a clip on the side. And so they were seeing these ordinary objects in new ways. And they were like, well, how do I fill my page? And is it okay to juxtapose things? And what does that mean for the tone? And what does my painting look like if I use these colors? And so it was really interesting hearing them make choices about how they were creating their art through their viewfinders, and really thinking back to sort of like the temporal nature of art. And I did have some students who asked me if they could destroy their pieces of art after 6 weeks. They also were like, oh, this is temporary, right? We're gonna destroy this. And I did share with them that that after he died, they started to make new ones again. And they were actually kind of intrigued by that. So we had some negotiations and some talking about what does it mean to save art and who does the art actually belong to, which is was actually really interesting for them as well, because they're students, and often we as teachers use art how we want the art that they produce to be used rather than how they want it to be used. And so that was kind of, they actually had questions back to the know and seek. They had questions about, would he want us to recreate these pieces? And does he have any say over it? Which was really interesting. We did also have some we had some conversations about using the tool and how zooming in and helps you think about art and everyday objects in new ways. And the students actually had a great job of tying it back to like filters. They use filters online, and they use when they use their cameras or their phones, right? They apply different filters to see things in new ways, and how that impacts what you actually see. And then the conversation when we came back to leadership was sort of like, are filters a good thing? So if I take something and filter it in this way, can I still understand what someone else can see? Or am I changing my own image? They got very metacognitive and like almost very philosophical about like, what is an apple? Is it really an apple? Like if I see it differently than you, are we seeing the same apple? And what does it actually mean in terms of leadership? Because a good leader can see different points of view. And so the students actually were like, oh, we're doing this so we can see things differently. And I was like, yes, that's actually true. And so they did agree that they saw that in this activity, that they felt like they had a better eye, a better lens on looking at ordinary things. And they saw how that it tied to building up leadership skills that they might not have had previously, which I was really impressed by. And the other part of this conversation which was interesting, is I asked them about whether or not using the lens finder made them feel like they were constrained. And so the difference having asked, like, if I said, please draw the room and everything in it versus using a lens finder, what was the benefit of using a lens finder? And a lot of the kids said, had you said draw the room, we would have been overwhelmed. We wouldn't have known where to start. We would have just not done it, essentially. And one of the students, this boy, he said, actually using the lens finder allowed me to really focus on specific items, and I didn't feel as overwhelmed. I knew how to get started. And so again, tying that back to leadership, we talked about how there's a reason leaders don't focus on everything, but they often focus on just a couple things. As well as talking about how constraints, we talk about this a lot, how constraints actually lead to creativity and how constraints lead to innovation and new ideas. And so how using the viewfinder actually, for some of the students, produced better drawings than if they'd been asked to do the whole thing, which was really interesting. And so I think at the end, they were like, we really like these viewfinders. Can we use them more often in terms of being able to generate new ideas, which was very cool. And so here's some more examples of some of the things that students drew through their viewfinders. We have an ordinary piece of paper that she spent the entire time really focusing on, because she was like, this is what I see and this is what I want to draw, as well as some different, a student book and a student water bottle, again, kind of bringing them alive and really focusing on those items. And so really looking back at those essential questions, I was asking the students to take a risk. And you'll see this actually even more so in the next activity I asked them to do, is really thinking about what does it mean to be vulnerable? Artists are often vulnerable, students are often vulnerable, and leaders are definitely vulnerable. And as fourth graders, students, they didn't want to admit that they were sometimes vulnerable. So I actually asked them to go through and with a partner discuss all of these. Like, do leaders take risks? What is vulnerability? Do you need to feel safe in your environment? Why is self-awareness important? And they had these great conversations with their partners. And I said, who in this classroom thinks they take risks? And they all raised their hand. Actually, one student did not. She's very self-aware. The others, and I asked, how safe do you think, is our classroom safe? And they raised their hand. And I said, how self-aware are you? Do you understand, do you really understand yourself? They all raised their hand. And I'm like, okay, we're going to do an activity and we're going to see really how vulnerable can you be? Can you really take a risk? And what does that mean and how you react to yourself and how you react to others? And so I challenged them to do this activity where we made portraits. And so in pairs, students worked in pairs, and they took turns sketching the portrait of the other person. And they were not allowed to look down at the paper when they were drawing. So they were looking at each other. They had the paper in one hand, they had a pencil in the other hand, but they had to continuously look at the partner. And they couldn't do it. They started laughing. They started getting upset. They're like, this isn't working. I'm not good at this. This picture is going to be horrible. And it was amazing listening to them talk and laugh. Some of them laughed at themselves and some of them got upset with themselves. And so they both sketched each other. And obviously we took turns. There's a whole routine of actually doing this. And then I asked them to draw a second set of portraits. I gave them permission to draw a portrait that was not realistic. I said, please draw an abstract portrait. You may not look at your partner still, but please have it be abstract. And it was interesting to watch how the room and the emotions in the room changed. Students felt much more comfortable having been given permission to draw an abstract picture rather than a realistic picture. And it was really interesting to hear their conversations and be like, oh, I think this year is probably going to be in the wrong spot, but that's okay. And they actually were like giving themselves permission to make mistakes when the first set of portraits, they could tell, like the conversation was about like, I think the ear is going to be in the wrong spot. I can't do this. This isn't going to work. And it was interesting at how the difference in my directions provided a different set of expectations in the students' heads about what kind of expectations I had for what they were supposed to do and how comfortable they actually felt in doing it. And so we had these great conversations afterwards about like, okay, doing this activity, did it involve taking a risk? And they said, yes. Yes, it did. We were not comfortable with doing this activity. And I was like, do you have a better self? Do you understand yourself better? And they said, yes, we don't like doing this activity. But like, they had such a better sense of like what it meant to be vulnerable. Yes, we were vulnerable. We felt like our friend was going to make fun of us. We felt like we weren't good at this. I didn't know what to do. And especially the kids who think of themselves as good artists really struggled because in their mind, good art, one of the students was like, good art doesn't look like this. It looks like a portrait that looks like a student. And my portrait does not look like my partner. And so she was like, I realize that I have a hard time with this. And we really took some time to really tie it back to leadership and how important it is to really understand yourself. And how do you, and understand it. They know, the students can say, yes, leaders take risks, but then how do you provide opportunities to yourself to learn how to take risks? And I asked them, I said, is this a good activity in pushing yourself out of your comfort zone? And they said, yes. Is this going to help you perhaps become a better leader because you now know you took a risk? And they said, yes, we took a risk. It was horrible. And so it was the self-awareness of like taking risks is hard. Because I think often they think of taking risks as like, oh, I tried a new food. And that isn't really taking a risk. That is, maybe you stepped out of your comfort zone, but really you chose to do that. In this particular, activity, I pushed them out of their comfort zone. And leaders are often put in situations where they don't have a choice of how they react and what they do. And this activity put them in that situation where they had to figure out how to react. And some of the kids were really interesting in their responses. They one girl who actually raised her hand and said, "I don't take risks," raised her hand and said, "Yes, this was really hard for me, and I know I struggle with taking risks." So it was really interesting. So here's some more examples of some of the drawings that students made. It's interesting, they actually got better, I think, which is maybe why they felt more comfortable doing it a second time. We have the one that was sort of like the student first tried it and then was told they could do the abstract, and this one on the right is actually the abstract picture, which was interesting. And so I actually think some students, because they kind of relaxed and let themselves just go with the flow, actually did a better job of making a picture, which was kind of an interesting. And so this activity was super challenging, but it was really, really useful. It really uncovered truths about the students themselves that they might not have ever even talked about. It allowed them to be uncomfortable and to talk about uncomfortable situations. And honestly, back to the earlier conversation about trust, push the kids to trust each other, because that was one of their biggest issues, is they were worried about what their classmates would say. And so they understood that a leader is often put in situations where you might be in a situation where someone's untrustworthy, and then you still have to do it. And there was some fabulous, fabulous conversations around that.
Okay, I'm going to take you very quickly through a portrait exercise that my fifth graders did. We were in teams of 2. We had one person on the team who could see the portrait, and the other was drawing blindly in terms of just listening skills, and speaking with clarity was to be used to create the drawings. And I know we're tight on time, so I'm going to move along here. Clarity and listening with intention were just 2 such important pieces that they came out of this experience with. And at the end, they were allowed to ask some questions. If I was the drawer, I could ask, well, what about this? Or I don't have a nose yet. Or where does this go? And they were allowed to get a little bit of clarity that way. But they knew what they wanted to ask, which was kind of interesting. One of the big things that I find is everything we do is cyclical. They begin a project, they know what they're supposed to do, and they reflect. Here's what I've done. Here's what I should improve. Let me go back and try it again. So now we're revising. They reversed responsibilities. I now have a different picture. I'm describing to you. Now at the end, you ask me some questions for clarity. Now let's look together. And here's an example of description and what came with it. But that reflection piece was so important time and time again for them to be able to understand, what are we trying to do here and how do I get the job accomplished? And they did a great job with it. I'm going to click one more time. And this is just a couple more examples of what they came up with, my happy guide. And I think, Sherry, I'm turning it over to you. No?
Yeah, great.
Okay.
So those of you who participated in our webinars before know we like, before we close, for you to be thinking about your next step. So this is a time for you to reflect. And please add your comments in the chat box, so that we can see what you're thinking. So what ideas stick that you plan on using? Let us know, type in the chat box, which of the ideas here are you going to use in your school? And how will this webinar's insights influence how you talk with students about leadership? So, great, Donna. You're going to be using Seek. Thank you. And it's something that you can use in so many different ways, right? With children's literature, before you read a story, you can read the pictures. With fine art. Focus Finder. Thank you, Catherine. Right, the Focus Finder is awesome. And I saw in the text box someone suggested the little squares the size of a slide, like a photographic slide, are really nice too. Perfect. So it also helps when you're planning next steps to be very focused, using a little building off Jessica's students' insight about being focused. Start planning when you're going to be sharing these activities, right? So, the parameters around a project, absolutely. So students understand the benefits of focus, and they had that as an epiphany. So it's not only a physical tool, but the leadership link to it is absolutely fantastic. So right before we go to Q&A, oh, super. See, Focus Finder, great. How about the idea of portraits and this whole idea of really listening carefully as a description of a portrait? Is anybody thinking of following up with the portraits? Great. I just want to remind you that it can be your artwork, or if you get the students' parents' permission, you could also post the student artwork in the library. And for the first 50 educators who post their artwork, you get the case of multicultural crayons. So, and also just want to point out here, because we do have a lot of guests from different countries, just want to point out we love to see your artwork wherever you live. But due to shipping and duty requirements, we can only ship this gift to addresses in the U.S. and Canada. But please, everyone is able to post the artwork online. And if this session today piqued your interest, particularly with Seek, just want to point out that we provide professional development to school districts and have a variety of protocols like Seek that help build creative leadership and multi-literacy strategies in the schools. So if you'd like more information about how a Crayolean can come to your district, to your school, and provide professional development, just write to our email address, creativelyalive@crayola.com. Now let's look at questions. I know you've got a couple questions that folks have sent over to us. So I think one of the overarching things that we're hearing is people are interested in how you specifically and intentionally help students make the connection between leadership and the art activity. Jessica, if you want to, I know you had talked about that a lot, and you were mentioning that you marveled at the students' connections. Can you comment on how that intentional discussion was set up?
I think it was partially because we actually talked about leadership first. And so when I was able to draw the conversation back to leadership when things that they said during the art time fed into it. And because we kind of had a really in-depth conversation, they talked about taking risks. They talked about trust. They talked about other people's point of view. And so I was like, I could be like, how does this activity remind us of the conversation we had last week? I pull back out the poster, we look at it, and the kids are like, oh, well, the lenses really help with point of view. And so providing kind of I already know that I want them to connect it back. And so I'm pretty intentional about when I reflect back to leadership, as well as making sure that the stuff that we talk about in leadership really will set the stage for continual conversations as we go on. I don't know if that's specific enough.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. So there's some questions about over what period of time some of these activities were done, and I think we can hear insights from both Nancy and Jessica on it. So Nancy, with your work on the leadership conversations and the portraits and Joel Shapiro's work, give us a sense of how much time was involved for that progression.
We started this little activity or set of activities in the middle, or actually the very beginning, of state testing. And state testing here in Pennsylvania took us a little over 3 weeks this year. So depending on the week and how much I had to do makeup and whatnot, it was once or twice a week for 35 to 40 minutes. So total we met about 6 times. And then I will say this week we met and had pizza for lunch, which was a grand finale. But I think it was Julie or Judy from Michigan made a comment about using this with her ESL students. 3 of my 7 are ESL students. They're currently in the ESL program. And the great thing for them, they have such potential for leadership, but they really felt that the art activities, the movement, and the shaping of their own figures and their words, that's what makes them comfortable and makes them willing to release, knowing it's safe for them to say what they need to say and begin their leadership journey. So it truly is the art and that trust that they built amongst themselves in our little room, I believe that put them on the road to where they'll one day be.
Great. And Jessica, there's a question on slide 20. You were sharing your students' reaction to reading the Roy Lichtenstein mural. About how much time did you spend with your students reading the Roy Lichtenstein mural and then creating their own focus finder art?
We probably spent about 2 hours. I didn't want to give them too much time between the conversations, and so actually we did it all in one day. I actually came in, taught the lesson about really looking at the murals, spending the time to do the seek, and then we actually did the lesson where they used the viewfinders about 2 hours later, because I felt like if we gave it actually too much time in between, that they would kind of lose the focus of that ordinary objects. Like they started with, it's like overthink it versus being like, there's a piece of cheese. You can draw a piece of cheese, and so about 2 hours total for that one.
And Nancy, up front, I know we were asking our participants to take a poll, and yet when you talked about leadership with your students, you were much more open-ended. But you want to talk a little bit about the process, because then after your students brainstormed their list of qualities, then you asked them to vote, which is a little different than we did in the webinar when we actually made a list. Do you want to talk a bit about, how you got that narrowed down, and how I guess the first part is how the students generated the list?
They generated the list. Well, we went through, what different activities does a leader participate in, lead, whatever. And then I said, okay, let's talk about attributes. What does leader have to have? And they came up with they have to be trustworthy, they have to be good listeners, so forth and so on. So when we went back at the end, we had that original list. And I had them vote. We actually voted 4 times. First time around, they had to vote for, I think, 4 of them. We pared the list down, and they voted for 2. We pared it down, and then they voted for 1. So that was when they came up with the 3 that they were most interested in, and that was literally such a reflection of the times. They were looking for a leader that was kind, that was respectful towards them, and that they could trust.
Mm-hmm.
There you go.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to provide any context for what was going on in your community, or you said that at that time?
Well, I am in an inner city school. It is a charter school. We service, we're a Title I school, about 90, maybe 96% free and reduced lunch. And that's where we are.
Yeah, yeah. And I'd like to address the last question that came in, which was asking pretty much for our point of view on when students are encountering pictures or artwork in books. And I just want to remind people that you can use Seek and you can read any piece of art, no matter how it comes in. It can be a piece of artwork in a book. But after students do Seek and they start to do this sort of observation and evidence and thinking about the composition and the intentions, and then they do the inquiry and want to know, then it's best to let them create based upon that inspiration. So the question was, about if we recommend that they copy, or, the comment even said, well, it's not creative for students to try to, copy what they see in a book, and agree with that what we like to do is use inspiration have conversations about what they observe, that evidence, that inquiry, and use that as a springboard for them to create something that inspired them, right? So that you're really bringing in some of the original thought. One of my favorite quotes about art and why it's so powerful is that every time you create, you put a little bit of yourself in what is created. And I think that's important, that students might look at other art as inspiration and learn how to read it and think about the artist, but then interpret it in their own way. Great. So just to answer your question, Courtney, from New Jersey, about the participants reading the PowerPoint, the presentation is archived, and so you may watch the presentation, the webinar recording, but we do not send out the PowerPoint. So we do invite people to come back into the community, join the community, and watch the recorded webinars. So you do have access to it in that format. Okay. Anything else? If you've got other questions, you can send them here. I know we've gone a little bit over. I see it's a little after 5, and appreciate, wow, we still have over 180 people in the room. So Nancy, Jessica, and I will be available to continue to comment, but we appreciate that you've all stayed on for more than an hour. So this is awesome. And, you know, just we'll stay on for a few more minutes if you have other questions you want to type in the chat box. Thank you, Angela, for saying you can't wait for the next webinar. It's probably a good opportunity for, Kristen needs to wrap up for us too and tell us when our next webinar is. Perfect segue here.
Thank you, Sherry. So just as a reminder, those who attended today's webinar live will receive their CE certificate tomorrow within 24 hours to your email. If you joined live by phone or if you're watching the recording, you will need to take the CE quiz before you can receive that CE certificate. And just as another reminder to join the community, the Champion Creativity community, if you're not already a member. And lastly, I know some of you are looking forward to our next webinar. September 13th is the date, so we have a summer break and then regroup in the fall. So we appreciate everyone staying online with us. It's a little after 5, but we still have plenty of educators in the room. And we look forward to seeing you in September. I can't read.
Meet the needs of diverse learners.
Oh, meeting the needs of diverse learners is the topic for that webinar. My apologies. So thank you all again, and have a great summer.